Arizona Territory. 1878, the red dust still clung to her hem when she stepped off the rail platform in Benson, her wedding veil stuffed inside the Bible she clutched like a lifeline. Leora Oakes had run. With the church bells still echoing behind her and the preacher's voice lost in the wind, she'd torn out of the chapel before the vows could be spoken. The man waiting at the altar, Thomas Grady, banker, widower, nearly twice her age, was not who she wanted, not who she could live beside. Her father called it a settlement of debts, but she called it what it was, a sale. Now the sun beat down hard overhead, drying sweat against her spine as she stepped into the dirt street with nothing but a satchel, a Bible, and the dress she had almost married in. She did not look back. "Miss," a voice called ahead, low and edged with caution. She stopped. A man stood beside a chestnut horse, saddle worn, rifle slung behind his shoulder. He had a lean build, sun-darkened skin, and eyes as steady as river stones. His hat shadowed his brow, but he tipped it back when he saw her better. Late 20s, maybe. No town dust on him. He had the look of someone who lived out past fences. "You lost?" he asked, tone even. "No," she said too fast. Then slower. "Not anymore." He looked at the Bible in her hands. "You sure about that?" he asked. She hesitated. "I left a wedding." The man nodded once, not judging. "I figured. She drew a breath. "I need to get away, anywhere but here." He stepped forward, careful not to spook her. "You got family?" "None that would help me." "Money?" She shook her head. "You planning to start walking into the desert with no water?" he asked. Her hand tightened around the Bible. "If I have to." He studied her for a moment, then hitched his horse's reins to the rail. "My name's Merritt Zane," he said. "I have a cabin out west of St. David. It is not much, but it is safe. I can give you that." She stared at him. "Why would you help me?" "Because you look like you need it," he said simply. "And because I have known what it is to run from something." Leora's throat ached. She nodded. Merritt helped her up onto the horse, then swung up behind her. His hand on the reins was warm beside hers, steadying her as they rode. The town slipped behind. She did not cry until the buildings vanished and there was nothing ahead but the long road and the hard blue sky. They rode for hours. Merritt said little. That suited her fine. Her heart still thudded like she might hear hooves behind them, but none came. When they stopped to rest the horse, he handed her a canteen and bread from his saddlebag. She ate sitting on a stone, her veil still tucked in that Bible. "Was it your choice?" he asked finally. She looked at him, startled. "The wedding," he said. "No," she said quietly. "My father arranged it. I only met Thomas Grady 3 times. He said I would be safe. He said Mr. Grady had a good name, but I watched the way he looked at me, the way he spoke to the woman who helped with my dress. I knew what kind of man he was." Merritt said nothing for a while. Then he nodded. "You did the right thing." They rode again, slower now. By the time dusk painted the hills, they reached a small cabin tucked against a ridge of pines. Smoke curled from the chimney. He opened the door and stepped back to let her inside first. It was clean, simple. A cot, a table, a stove, and a rocking chair. A rifle hung above the hearth. A crocheted blanket lay folded on the bed. "You can take the bed," Merritt said. "I will sleep outside." "You do not have to. It is not about what I have to," he said. "It is about what is right." That night, she lay in the bed and stared at the ceiling while Merritt's boots crunched softly outside. She heard him settle near the fire pit, the low crackle of wood, the whistle of wind through pine. She held her Bible close, but she did not pray. She just breathed. In the morning, she woke to the smell of coffee. Merritt was at the stove, sleeves rolled, hair damp from a nearby stream. "You sleep all right?" he asked. "I did," she said. He passed her a mug. "You still planning to run?" She looked down into the dark liquid. "I do not know," she said honestly. "Well," he said, sitting across from her, "you are not a prisoner here. You are safe. You decide what happens next." She watched him in the light. He moved with quiet calm, like someone used to being alone but not hardened by it. He did not ask for her story again. He just let her stay. Days passed. She helped him with chores, fetching water, mending a torn shirt, picking berries near the creek. She found herself talking more. He listened. Never interrupted, never judged. One afternoon, she was stacking firewood when he stopped beside her. "You handle yourself well," he said. "You are not the kind of woman who needs rescuing." She looked up at him, heart quick. "But you did anyway." "I did not rescue you," he said. "I just gave you a place to land." Her voice was quiet. "That is what I needed." He reached out slow and brushed a leaf from her hair. His fingers paused there just a second too long. "You are not who I thought would show up at my fence," he said. She smiled. "You are not who I thought would meet me at the edge of town." He stepped back then, clearing his throat. "I will get supper started." That night they ate on the porch. The stars were thick overhead, the kind that made you feel small but still seen. She held the Bible in her lap, worn now from her hands. "I used to believe this book would tell me everything," she said. "And now, I think maybe people do that better." He looked at her, firelight dancing in his eyes. "Leora," he said, "I do not know what comes next. But if you stay, I promise I will never be the kind of man you had to run from." Her breath caught. He reached for her hand, slow and sure. "Let me be your new vow." Her hand curled into his. She did not speak. She just nodded, her eyes bright, her chest aching in the best way. He smiled, soft and real. And she knew for the first time in her life that this was what love felt like when it chose you back. The air in the hills shifted with the season. By late October, the wind pulled sharper through the canyon, and mornings came with a thin crust of frost over the water trough. Leora rose early, before the sun cleared the pines, and learned the rhythm of the land, how the light crept down the hill like a slow blessing, how the mule deer passed through just after dawn, how Merritt split his firewood by the same flat stump each day, always in 3 neat piles. She had taken to feeding the hens and checking the traps strung along the creek bend. Her dress, once stiff with lace, now hung softer from her frame, the hem frayed where the brush had taken it. She didn't mind. She'd mended it herself. One morning, Merritt returned from the eastern ridge with a rabbit slung from his saddle and a new cut across his forearm. It wasn't deep, but it bled steady. "You favor your left when you climb," she noted, washing the wound in the basin out front. "That's how you slipped." He blinked at her. "You've been watching my gait." "I've been watching everything," she muttered, tying off the strip of cloth from her petticoat around his arm. "It's how I survived in my father's house." Merritt didn't speak for a beat. "Then, what did you do to pass the time before?" "I embroidered names I never wanted to wear," she said, "and read scripture I didn't believe would save me." He looked down at the cloth with her handiwork tight and clean. "You fix wounds better than most field medics I knew. I had to learn how to set a bone when our cook broke her wrist and father wouldn't send for a doctor." "Why not?" She was Mexican. Leora sat back on her heels. "He said it wasn't worth the money." Merritt's jaw shifted, but he didn't speak. She stood and poured out the bloodied water. The wind tugged her hair loose from the knot at her neck. That night, Merritt brought out a fiddle from a weathered case tucked behind the door. The varnish had dulled and the strings looked older than the cabin, but when he drew the bow across, the notes wavered and then steadied into a tune that made her chest ache. "You play," she said, not asking. "My ma taught me." He adjusted the pegs. She was Choctaw. Had fingers like a bird's wing, always moving. "What happened to her?" "Died in the fever, same year the rains failed." Leora folded her hands in her lap. "I was 8 when my mother passed." She was the only one who ever brushed my hair. They sat with the music between them, not filling the silence but shaping it. The tune shifted, slower, then faster. Leora tapped her heel once, then again, then stood and offered her hand. "I don't know the steps," she warned. "I'll teach you." They moved awkwardly at first, boots scuffing the wood, her laugh breaking out sharp when she stepped wrong. Merritt only nodded, guiding her again and again until their hands found a rhythm. Her palm fit in his like it had always been meant to. When the fire burned low, she rested her head against his chest. He didn't move for a long while. Then his arms came around her, careful but certain. "You sure this is what you want?" he asked, voice low. "I'm not used to wanting anything," she said, "but I want this." He didn't kiss her. Not yet. But his hand found hers again, and they stood like that until the coals turned to ash, and the wind outside curled around the eaves like a lullaby. The next morning, she woke before him and set a kettle to boil. She pulled on his old flannel shirt over her dress and stepped outside to gather kindling. The sky was still soft gray, the world holding its breath before the sun. A rider came up the trail. She froze. The man dismounted slow, older, wearing a town coat and polished boots too fine for this country. His face was sharp, eyes narrow. "You Leora Oakes," her throat dried. "Who's asking?" "Name's Walter Grady, Thomas Grady's brother." "I don't know what you want." He stepped forward. "Thomas drank himself to death last week. Word says he never left that church after you ran." Leora gripped the kindling tighter. "That man's ghost doesn't belong to me." Walter nodded once. "I didn't come to shame you. I came to tell you that your father's debts died with Thomas. You're free of them. How do you know where to find me?" "Folks in Benson said a cowboy rode off with a girl in a white dress. Wasn't hard to follow." Merritt stepped out onto the porch, rifle held loose but ready. Walter raised his hands. "I'm not here for trouble." "Then you've said what you came to say," Merritt answered. Walter looked between them. "You plan to marry her. That's none of your concern." Walter shrugged. "Suppose it ain't." He turned back to his horse. "But if you do, give her a better life than the one she left." He mounted up and rode off without another word. Leora watched the dust settle behind him. "You all right?" Merritt asked. She nodded. "I think that was the first time someone came looking for me and didn't try to take something." He stepped beside her, brushed a twig from her sleeve. "You're not theirs anymore." "I know," she said. "I'm yours." This time he kissed her, no hesitation, no pause. Just the quiet certainty of two people who had been waiting their whole lives to be seen. When he pulled back, her breath caught. "I'll build you a kitchen garden," he said, "and a porch that faces sunrise. And I'll make you a home that never feels empty," she whispered. The wind blew cold, but neither of them stepped inside. They stood there, hands clasped, as the sun rose clean over the ridge, spilling gold over the land they would call theirs. Merritt planted the first fence post just after sunrise, his hands raw from digging through the hard, packed clay. The ground held tight to the cold this time of year, and each strike of the post driver rang out across the quiet slope behind the cabin. Leora stood a few yards off, watching the line he staked along the edge of the clearing. "You're not trying to keep anything out," she said. "You're marking a beginning." He straightened, wiped the back of his wrist across his brow. "It's for the goats. I was trading pelts in Tombstone last week. Man near the livery said he's got a pair near Kidding. Offered me both for a quarter and 2 jars of honey." She smiled, faint and quiet. "I never thought I'd live somewhere where goats were part of a future." "You'll have milk by spring," he said. "Maybe cheese if we figure out how." She walked closer, lifted one of the smoothed cedar rails. "I want to help with this." "You've been helping." "I mean building something. Not just keeping things going, making something new." Merritt looked at her then, and something in his expression shifted. not wonder something more grounded than that. Like he saw a piece of himself in her hunger to belong to a place, not just survive it. "I'll teach you to set posts," he said. "I already learned how to pull nails from my father's porch after a storm. I figure driving them in can't be much harder." "You'll see," he murmured, amused but not at her expense. By midday, she'd driven a post of her own, leaning hard into the driver while Merritt steadied it. Her palms blistered, but she didn't complain. When their shadows lengthened across the field, they sat down with bread and dried apples between them, and the silence felt like company. "You ever think about children?" she asked, not turning toward him. He swallowed his bite before answering. "I do," she nodded once. "I don't know if I can have them, never had reason to wonder before." He reached for her hand, not to reassure, just to hold. "If we can, we can. If we can't, you and me still counts as a family." She looked at his hand on hers, the dirt still beneath his nails, the honest wear of it. "I'd like to try." Later that week, the first snow came light, fleeting, more of a warning than a storm. Leora stood at the window, watching it melt on the warm roof. Merritt came in from the shed with a box of nails under one arm, his coat speckled white. "We'll need to chop more pine," he said. "That ridge to the north's gonna hold snow early this year." "I'll ride with you," she said. "If we're going to winter here, I want to know every tree that's ours to cut." He looked over at her, then stepped to the stove. "There's a map in my head. I've never shared it." "Then show it to me." They left at dawn the next day, riding double on the mare until the slope grew too steep. She walked the last half-mile beside him, breath fogging in the thin air, boots crunching over frost-stiff grass. He pointed out the ridgelines where the elk passed in late winter, where the stream curved under the bluff and pooled deep enough to trap fish come spring. When they found the stand of pine he'd spoken of, Merritt handed her the smaller axe. "I've never felled a tree," she said. "You'll feel it give before it goes. That's the moment to watch." She swung careful, steady. It took longer than his, but the crack echoed clean when the trunk finally leaned. She stepped back, heart thudding, as the tree bowed to the earth and settled into the snow-dusted brush. They worked until their arms shook. He built the sled frame from saplings, tied with rope, and together they dragged the trunks back to camp. That night, they ate cornmeal mush with wild onion, sitting close by the stove. Merritt's fingers grazed her knee, a quiet gesture that said more than words. She leaned against him, cheek to his shoulder. "I was afraid that first night here that I'd made a mistake. I was afraid you'd leave before you found out you hadn't. I've stopped waiting to feel like I belong. Now I just do." He kissed her hair, barely more than a breath. They married in the cabin, just the two of them. No preacher, no ring. He read from a page he'd written by hand, and she answered with the words she'd carried folded in her apron pocket for weeks. When it was done, she tucked the page into the back of her Bible, beside the veil she no longer needed. That night, she lay beside him under the patched quilt, her hand curled in his. No more running. No more debts. Just the sound of wind across the roof and the slow, steady rhythm of a man who had chosen her not as a bargain, but as a home. And in the dark, with the fire low and the snow whispering against the shutters, she whispered, "You are my every vow now." He answered only by drawing her closer, like he meant to never let go. The wind changed by late November, coming down from the north with a bite that worked through seams and wood grain. Merritt had begun patching the roof with pine tar and bark shingles, and Leora lined the walls inside with muslin sacks filled with dry grass. She'd stitched them herself, fingers pricked and calloused, the thread dyed with walnut hulls she'd boiled in a tin pot. They'd taken to lighting the stove before dawn, not for cooking but to keep the cold from settling into the bones of the house. Merritt kept his rifle near the door now, not for men, but for the mountain lion tracks that had shown up behind the coop. One morning, Leora found him crouched by the fence with his hand pressed into the earth beside the paw print. "I'll set a bell on the gate," she said, dropping a length of cord beside him. "If it comes close again, we'll hear it." He stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "You're thinking ahead of me now." She met his gaze. "You're the first thing I ever planned for." They didn't speak of it again, but the bell was hung by sundown. Inside the cabin, a new rhythm had taken hold. Leora had begun copying passages from a book Merritt's mother left behind, a ledger written in Choctaw and French. She didn't know the languages, not yet, but she traced the loops and lines, learning the shape of them with her hands. Merritt would sit across from her at the table, carving notched handles for spoons and tools from cedar. "You ever think about going back east?" she asked one evening, her needle paused mid-stitch. He shook his head once. "There's nothing there that knows my name. I used to think I'd die in a parlor in a dress that didn't fit me with people who only remembered me by what I cost. You won't die that way." She looked up. "How do you know?" "Because you live different now. You wake up and shape things. You don't wait for someone to hand you a life." She set her needle down and crossed the room. "What about you? What did you think your life would be?" He leaned back, his carving knife resting on the table. "I didn't think much past the next sunrise. Until you." She touched his chest, her fingers resting above the spot where his shirt pulled tight from kneeling over the fire too long. "I want to learn everything you know." "Then we'll start with the ledger," he said. "My mother used to hum the words when she cooked. I remember the sound more than the meaning. I don't care how long it takes. You're not a woman who leaves halfway through." She smiled, small and steady. "Neither are you." The next day they rode out to the canyon's edge to gather pitchwood for kindling. The snow hadn't held there yet, and the air smelled of juniper and stone. Leora dismounted first, her boots crunching on the red gravel. She moved with purpose now, her body shaped by labor, not propriety. Merritt watched her tie the mare's reins to a dead limb before she turned to him. "I found a nest of quail last week near the far ridge," she said. "If we're careful, we can get eggs before the foxes do." He nodded. "You mark it," with a bent twig, "like you taught me." They gathered wood until their arms ached, then sat by a flat boulder to eat. She passed him a cloth of dried venison and cornmeal cakes. He poured water from his flask into a tin cup between them. "You ever miss the sound of other people?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "But only in the way you miss a song you liked once before you heard a better one." She leaned her shoulder against his. "I used to think silence meant being forgotten. What does it mean now? That I'm safe." They stayed until the sun dipped low, casting long shadows between the rocks. On the ride back, Leora rested her cheek against Merritt's back, her arms looped around his waist. The sky turned rose-colored behind the hills, and the air smelled like winter coming on sure and slow. That night, as Merritt locked the door and banked the stove, Leora drew the quilt up over them and whispered, "I want to raise something here. A garden, a child, a life, whatever we can." He turned to face her, his hand cupping her cheek. "Then we will." No promise pressed harder than that. Nothing spoken louder than two people choosing, day after day, to stay where they are already found. The first thaw came early, softening the edges of the snowdrifts in the hollows and coaxing green from the slopes above the creek. Ice broke from the tree branches in quiet drops, and the hens began to lay again, their clucks sharp against the hush of the melting woods. Leora stood at the edge of the cabin's garden plot, a hoe in one hand and a folded scrap of paper in the other. She'd drawn it herself, a map of where she meant to plant turnips near the eastern fence, beans along the trellis, and a long row of sunflowers where the light held longest. Merritt came up behind her, brushing wood shavings from his sleeves. "You're planning a harvest," he said, glancing at the page. "That's a kind of faith." "I think I've earned some," she answered, eyes still on the ground. "We both have." He nodded once, then stepped aside, letting her press the first furrow without help. The soil turned dark and damp under her hands, and she breathed in the scent of it like something clean and possible. That afternoon, a rider came up the trail, an older woman wrapped in a woven shawl, her face lined deep with sun and time. Merritt's jaw set when he saw her, but he didn't reach for the rifle. "Name's Annie's," the woman said as she dismounted. "Your mother and I gathered herbs together before the war. She never mentioned a son, but I knew the look of her eyes when I saw yours." He stepped forward slowly. "You knew her well." "Well enough to bring this," Annie said, pulling a cedar box from her saddlebag. "She left it with me the winter before she passed, told me to wait for the right time. I reckon this is it." Merritt didn't move to take it at first. Leora stepped up beside him and touched his arm. "If you want me to go inside, no," he said. "You stay." He opened the box with care. Inside lay a folded shawl, a silver brooch shaped like a hawk in flight, and a bundle of letters wrapped in hair ribbon. He ran a thumb across the brooch without speaking. Annie's nodded once. "She wanted you to have the stories she couldn't tell." He looked up. "Thank you." "I'll be heading west before sundown," she said. "But if you ever find your way near Fort Bowie, there's folks there who remember her name." Leora offered her a jar of honey for the road. Annie's took it with a faint smile, then turned her horse and rode out without another word. Merritt read the letters that night by lantern light, Leora beside him, their knees touching beneath the quilt. His mother's writing was small and slanted, full of wild plant names and half-sung prayers in Choctaw. She'd written about the creek where he was born, about the way his father had laughed only once, about the dreams she had for him, none of them loud or grand, just rooted and free. "She wanted me to find someone who'd never ask me to be less," he said, folding the last letter. "She said love ought to be honest work, not a burden." Leora touched the edge of the shawl, its weave worn but whole. "Then she'd be glad you waited for me. Spring brought more than thaw. The goats birthed 2 kids, one black, one white, and Leora named them Maple and Thorn." Merritt built a second pen, and she coaxed milk from the wary mother with a gentleness that made him pause sometimes, watching from the porch with a quiet pride. They planted the garden together, hands stained with soil, foreheads freckled with sun. On warmer nights they ate outside, legs tangled under the table Merritt had built from split pine. Leora began reading the ledger aloud, sounding out the unfamiliar words until they shaped themselves into meaning. Merritt corrected her gently, but less often with time. One morning she stepped out with a jar of water and paused by the fence. "I haven't bled in 6 weeks." He looked up from where he was sharpening the axe. "You sure?" She nodded slowly. "I think there's something growing in me. And for the first time, I'm not afraid of what that means." He crossed the yard in 3 strides and took her face in both hands. "Then we'll raise it together, just like everything else." They didn't speak of names yet. They didn't need to. Some things were better grown in silence, like roots pressing deep before the first leaf opens. The months passed, and the hills bloomed gold with wildflowers. Leora's belly rounded steady, and Merritt carved a cradle from aspen, sanding it smooth by the fire while she read aloud from the ledger. They made room, not just in the cabin, but in the shape of their days, in the way they worked slower now, with more laughter between them, in the way she leaned into his side without asking. By the time the baby came, the sky was heavy with heat, and the garden bent low with beans and squash. Merritt boiled water, tore sheets, and held her hand through the long, shuddering hours. She didn't cry out, not once, only breathed through it, steady and sure, the way she had faced every season since she first stepped onto his porch. Their daughter arrived just before dusk, red-faced and furious, her fists curled tight like she meant to wrestle the world. Leora held her close and whispered, "You're not born into debt, little one. You're born into love." Merritt kissed them both, his hands shaking for the first time since he'd held his mother's letters. They named her Wren. Years bent the cabin into a home. A second child followed a boy with his father's patience and his mother's fire. Leora taught them to read the ledger, to plant by the moon and listen for the shift in wind before a storm. Merritt took them hunting, taught them to walk soft and speak true. They never left the land. They didn't need to. On their 10th summer together, Merritt built a bench beneath the cottonwood by the creek. He carved their initials into the wood with a heart between them, not for vanity, but to mark the place where everything had begun. Leora brought the shawl down from its shelf and draped it over her shoulders. They watched the children chase frogs through the reeds. "I used to wonder what it would feel like to be known," she said. "You are," he answered. "Every part of you." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "And you, I'm home." The sun dipped low. Fireflies began to rise. And in the hush of that soft, lit evening, they sat hand in hand. Two people who had built a life not from what they'd run from, but from what they'd chosen each other. Always each other.